This question comes from the MCAT passage that you just read from Psychological, Social, and Biological Foundations of Behavior section. So basically the psychosocial section of the MCAT. And I wrote this question purposely because I wanted to use it as an example of database and statistical reasoning, which is skill number 4. So it's mapped to that skill. So what I've also done is, you'll need the passage, but what I've also done is I've copy and pasted the data chart, in this case, the bar chart here. So the question is, which of the following experimental conditions were most likely not statistically significant? So this is important that we recognize that. And so if it's not statistically significant, we mean that the p-value is greater than 0.05. And you'll see that in the experiment, there was pretty much 4 conditions. From left to right, there was the study once group, and you could consider this the control group, really, in the experiment. Then it was the recall once group, repeated masked group, and finally the repeated spaced group. And so we have the x-axis here, we have the y-axis here. One thing I do want to point out before we get into the details of the question is that the y-axis is really the score, the proportion of final recall, the score on the test. But notice it's not in a percent, which you commonly see, but rather it is in decimal format. So one of the things that is a little bit vague, or could be perceived as a little bit tricky, is the fact that nowhere in the passage and nowhere in the chart that they give you do they tell you what kind of error bars these are. So you'll notice it's very easy to read. Obviously, the last group or condition, the repeated space, recalled the most, about 75% or 0.75. And we'll assume that the exam was out of 100% or 1.0. So that's easy. It's easy to read. But what's a little bit vague is the fact that they have these superimposed error bars. And you don't know what kind of error bars they are, and that's why it makes this a little bit challenging. So just to review, there are 4 types of error bars, and I'll just write that over here. And what are the 4 types of error bars? There is a range, okay, there's range. There is standard deviation. There is standard error, which is also sometimes called standard error of the mean. And then there are confidence intervals. In the literature today, confidence intervals, especially in the clinical literature, are very frequently used. So it would be in your best interest to review confidence intervals for the MCAT, for sure. But now let's talk about these 4 error bars. Range and standard deviation are descriptive in nature. Standard error and confidence intervals, in contrast, are inferential in nature. That's, by the way, that's why standard error and confidence intervals are more powerful, because they're inferential in nature, amongst other things. So we don't know what kind of error bars are here, but when that happens, I would suggest thinking about these last 2 types of error bars, standard error and confidence intervals. And the reason that I say that when it's not given, and look carefully in the passage, because oftentimes it is, but in this case, I purposely wrote the question so that it wasn't. And the reason I was doing that is I'm trying to push you into thinking and applying when you're given less information than you wish. And the reason, again, that I'm saying that consider these standard error and confidence intervals is because if you do, then the overlap or lack of overlap, if you will, of the error bars becomes important when you don't have any p-values. That's another thing. They didn't tell you, they didn't have asterisks telling you which ones are significant, et cetera. Of course, if it's significant, the p-value is going to be less than 0.05. So when we look at this, it's actually pretty straightforward, because what we see is when you look at the condition recall once, so you look at this condition, recall once, and you look at repeated masked, you'll see that recall once seems to be slightly higher than repeated mass, as far as the results on the final test, but you'll see that there's great overlap between the confidence intervals. And when you have a great overlap between the confidence intervals, you know that there's no statistically significant difference, okay? So when you look at the answer choices, the best answer choice is clearly D, because again, the recall once and repeated mass, there's no statistically significant difference between these conditions. Now, let's consider the other conditions, and we'll start with incorrect answer choice A, study once and recall once. So here's the study once group, okay, versus the recall once group. And you could see that the error bars are not overlapping at all. And in fact, there's quite a distance between them. So this suggests strongly that the p-value is less than 0.05. So this is statistically significant, okay? So this wouldn't be the correct answer. Choice B, which is incorrect as well, is between the recall once group and the repeated space group. So between the recall once group, I'll just put these dots for reference, and the repeated space group. And again, you could see that there's a great difference with certainly no overlap and a great distance between them. So we could be assured that the p-value here between these groups would be less than 0.05. And so this is incorrect. Finally, choice C, which is incorrect, is again repeated mass versus the repeated space group. And again, the error bars don't overlap, and we could assume that this is also a statistically significant difference with p-value less than 0.05. So in this question, the best choice is D, and it really is a question that pushes the boundaries of your database and statistical reasoning. And the question itself was based on a passage about retrieval, about learning. So it was a psychology passage, and it's mapped to information that you need to know for the psychology and sociology section, but it was definitely a psychology passage.